welcome back to Indieventure Extra, our bonus series where we interview key members of the games industry. My guests today are Davey Wreden and Karla Zimonja, writers at indie game studio Ivy Road. Davey, as you may know, is the creator of the Stanley Parable and the Beginner's Guide, and Karla is the co-creator of Gone Home. However, they joined me on this episode to discuss Wanderstop, Ivy Road's debut game about a burned-out warrior attempting to find solace through running a tea shop in the woods. For anyone familiar with Davey and Karla's work, it'll come as no surprise that this conversation was an absolute delight to facilitate. If you've yet to play Wanderstop, there are no spoilers to be found here, don't worry. We mainly chatted about how the game came to be, what it's like to make a game about burnout that is actively burning you out as you're making it, as well as the challenges and the benefits of making a narrative-led game within the framework of the cosy genre. We also spoke about Boro, my beloved Boro. Now, I have an impulse right up top to maybe apologise for the slightly looser nature of this interview, but I'm not going to. For anyone who's played the game, or as will become apparent as you listen to this conversation, one lesson from Wanderstop that has really stuck with me is that it's okay to not be perfect at everything. I may be a little bit fumbly in this one, but thankfully Davey and Karla absolutely aren't. I will say though that at the end of this interview, I attempted to make a joke that fell so flat that I've thought about it every single day since I recorded this episode, and that was like 2 weeks ago. I have cut it out of the version you're about to listen to, not only to save myself from the embarrassment, but also you. And it was really that painful that I think you would respect and maybe even like me less if you heard it. I tried to link Dark Souls to Wanderstop, and it went about as well as you'd expect. Anyway, we got stuck into things immediately after we started the call, so this episode is actually going to kick off halfway through a conversation that began before I managed to hit record. So just for some context, I had just told Davey and Karla that my partner, Yoli, who has never enjoyed a cosy game in her life, had not only finished Wanderstop, but had loved it. As always, any questions or feedback, get in touch. Otherwise, enjoy.
Often when you talk to people in the games circles, and often their partners are like less of that, and so when you hear that like someone's like, oh, my partner liked it, you're like, oh really, a regular person liked our game? And that is honestly like, that is positive, because doesn't always happen. There's so many hurdles, you know what I mean, to really getting into a lot of games that we don't think about.
I find one of the most gratifying, compliments or whatever is someone, it kind of like the thing crossing some sort of barrier, like I'm always really skeptical, and this is probably just me being like unnecessarily self-deprecating, but whenever someone is like already into the kind of thing that I make and then they're like, I loved it, there's always a part of me in my brain it's just like, you just I could feed you any drivel, any slop, right, and you'd slop it up. So I'm not saying that's true, but
well, it's like it was aimed directly at you. Of course you liked it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And we have been seeing, even just from some of the previews and demos and stuff, we have been seeing people in the like cozy game space be like, oh, Wanderstop, it's this cozy game. Oh, it's this fun thing, which is great. I'm glad they're having fun with it. But I'm like, I know that's not really, like, to me, that isn't really the heavy lifting of Wanderstop. Is, I hope, reaches farther than that, and I hope we got. So I'm very happy if the cozy game crowd embraces it as well. I would love it if it had reached beyond the center hole of this kind of player space.
Yeah. That's what's so, I love that I've just hit record, by the way, and we're 2 minutes in, and I'm like, I sort of expected speaking to the two of you would be like this, where immediately there's interesting conversation. But I think that's the exciting thing about it as a game, is it's sort of trying to reach out in different ways within this very established genre, right? Which I definitely think it succeeds at from playing it.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to hear.
But I am also a Davey Wreden fan, so maybe I just want to, eat the slop that you slop out, as you put in your own words. So
Davey, where's the slop? Davey, where's the slop?
Any garbage.
More slop.
Wanderstop.
Wanderstop.
I've seen it. Somebody said it on the internet, and I was like, "That's funny."
Come on down, cozy gamers. shovel it down your gullet.
Is this a thought you always have? Do you always have this self-deprecating side? Is it part of your creative process? Do you think?
Karla, you can. I'm not going to speak for Karla, but I have that in. That's like the defining characteristic of my creative process. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I don't recommend this, and I'm not intending to like do this as a, to be this kind of person in an ongoing way. But my creative process is like, I get up in the morning and I'm like, God damn, I'm such a piece of shit. And then, and then the whole day is just like, how can I fix that? And again, I do not recommend this, and I intend to like change this about my process, but it is very motivating. It certainly gets me to do the hard work of revising and revising and revising, editing and editing and redoing, and it has been very successful at getting the work out of me.
It's spurring you cruelly to do good work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a little questionable there, a little iffy,
I think the main reaction I'm having from that, other than obviously I think you should be kinder to yourself, but I know that's hard, is that I relate to that almost too much, to the point where I maybe, I should probably also make some changes in my life about how much I wake up and think I'm a piece of shit, and that carries me through to the time I go to sleep. Karla, do you offer a balance to that within the studio?
I don't literally do that. But how can I say this? I really need to get a lot of information about things before I feel like I can move within them or talk about them. So I'm a chronic over-preparer. Like, I have to really be prepared in order to feel like I'm prepared at all. And so many, whatever I'm doing, like, editing a thing, writing a thing, running a tabletop game or whatever, and people are all like, why don't you lighten up? And I'm like, you don't understand. I don't know anything about this at all. I have to have everything written down so that I know what to do. Okay. Like, it's very I do need to lighten up, but also, like, there is part of my brain that goes, you can lighten up when you're better at it.
Yeah, it's definitely one way of looking at it.
Hey, can I say something about the difference between Karla and my work process?
I'd love for you to.
That this I think has a lot to do with why our collaboration on the writing of Wanderstop, I think why it was at least part of why it was successful, in that we sort of complemented one another in this way, is that when it comes to my work and writing, I'm very, like, I don't draw, I have a really hard time putting up a boundary between my work and my personal life, right? I show up for work, and whatever emotions I'm feeling through the day, that's what I'm bringing showing up just day to day at work. And so it can be very full on, and it can be honestly kind of intense. And, these are like, all right, I'm aware of these, things and it can show up for people in different ways. But when Karla shows up to work, and Karla, you can tell me if you have a different perspective on this, but the way I see it is that when you show up to work, you're like, okay, what is the job that needs to get done today, and who do I need to be to best achieve that job? And you are more than willing to discard who you were yesterday or this morning in order to be the person that is needed right now for this new task. And you like to and this is, I think, why you like preparation so much, is because you like being able to go into a thing with all of the information to almost like morph yourself into the right person for this job at this role at this time. And I think that's, to me, in my mind, that's like why we collaborated well, is because like I could show up and be very emotionsy, and then you would be like, Davey, here's the job we're here to do today. And you would put up this box and it would be like, oh, okay, cool. That's the box that I'm going to try to occupy the box that Karla is outlining for me here as much as possible. And it keeps me from like spiraling all over the place.
Interesting. Yeah, I certainly don't think of it as a whole nother self, but like a mode, definitely.
Yeah, right. There's something you're shifting, you know?
Yeah, there's definitely modes that help me like, be like, absolutely. I mean, in some ways it's kind of reactive, so it's, fundamentally like not I don't know, proactive, I guess, or it's not necessarily.
But you are planning. You are doing some amount of prep.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. But yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. That's certainly possible. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I could see that.
I thought it worked really well. I thought it was a
It was a good collaboration.
I thought it was the kind of collaboration where it was like, oh, there's something that you and I are each providing for the other that is nurturing a good kind of eventual outcome.
Yeah, I definitely feel like there was like, as I described, there was sort of a period of like learning your style on this, first of all, like your actual creation of prose, like style or dialogue, I guess often. And then, just the actual interaction of going back and forth between different versions of that. That was definitely, I kind of had to figure that one out. But once I did, I felt like we just kind of got better and better at not losing track of the important stuff when we were doing iterations and edits and stuff.
Yeah, there's definitely a learning period of us figuring out one another's styles,
which I know isn't like normal, but also, there's only so many times that you actually end up doing this, in your career, really, unless you're like a consultant and, every month you're like, all right, what's the new project? Which is like not what I'm doing. So yeah.
How did I'm aware that I've put no structure on this yet, but I'm just really enjoying listening to you two speak. But how did the collaboration between the two of you first come about?
Well, Karla and I have known each other for a long time. You know, with those like, where did we meet? I don't know. Somewhere, sometime.
I'm like something % sure that we did meet at the IGF Awards back in...
Yeah, I do not remember.
2013, 2014.
And I mean that in a good way. I mean that in the like, you've just kind of always been in my space.
Yeah. I know them, whatever.
Fabric, like you're just the fabric of the world. And because, obviously Gone Home and Stanley were sort of making waves at a similar time, so we were kind of in this class of like a graduating class or something. We were coming up at a particular time. We saw each other a lot at events and things.
Yeah, exactly.
It was sort of that first wave of indies, and I mean, whatever that means. I guess the modern interpretation of indies, I would maybe say. Would you like? Did it feel like that? Does it feel like that?
I mean, at the time, I felt like we were at the I felt like we missed the wave, because you had the real early indies.
You did,
you had World. I mean, you can go back even further than this, but then when World of Goo and Meat Boy and Limbo and Braid,
fucking Braid, totally,
like
all that stuff.
And then in my mind, that was the indie wave, right?
Right, yeah, and we were absolutely post that. So like, it felt weird at the time, like we were really on the tail end of the curve. But like in retrospect, it was still part of the indie boom. Yeah.
In retrospect, we now kind of lump them all together, and in that sense, I do think that yes, we were in that golden age, that sort of moment in time where it was like anything was possible. I mean, God, there were so many games that came out then that I mean, they were very good games, but just by existing, it was like, wow,
it was such a big deal.
If they came out today, that same game would just get utterly lost.
Right. So there was an entirely different paradigm back then, literally with Steam, who was still the biggest arbiter of like
Mhm.
what was visible, even back then. And at the point that Gone Home went to the IGF, we were like, this allows us access to Steam Greenlight. Steam Greenlight was a thing. And
Mhm.
like you couldn't just go on Steam. And like that, like honestly, that IGF award enabling us to put our game on Steam, put Gone Home on Steam was that's the reason anybody knew anything about it. Like,
Mm.
and there was just so many fewer, and there was so like, yeah, the landscape was completely different. Like, I don't know if you've seen any graphs of it or anything, but it's like
Yeah.
just this freaking asymptotic curve in the past like 10 years
Yeah.
of how many indies are released. It's ridiculous. Back then it was not the case, and there was like, dozens like per couple month or per month or something, as opposed to like, yeah, this thousands and thousands.
Yeah.
So yeah, back then it was like, yeah, of course we knew each other because there's like an indie tag and you could just look at like the 50 games on there practically. Like, I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean.
Uh-huh.
You'd go to GDC and you'd meet like 90% of the indie scene.
Yeah.
And like
Yeah.
everybody was there, and you would just go around, and it was like, I remember it feeling like this, like, oh, there's a person in indie dev that I haven't met yet. And it would be this kind of like, gotta check that box off or something, gotta meet that. And so
Mhm.
we, know each other, we've had FaceTime, we've whatever,
Mhm.
and it felt consumable in a way. Like it was still a
Right.
lot, but it was consumable.
Right. It was
Yeah.
possible. Yeah.
Right. Right. And so that's why all these connections that we have from back then, it's this weird kind of like these grandfathered sort of connections where,
Mm.
like, oh, we just by virtue of being there at that time, we all kind of have this connection that will, maybe I haven't seen someone in a decade, but I'm like, oh no, we were a part of this thing together, and that means something, you know?
Yeah, the
Mm.
scene was small and, or I mean, my experience of it was relatively small.
Mhm.
Um, but like, yeah, it's that same, we used to hang around in the same Discord or whatever, the same forum or the same IRC channel or whatever kind of thing. And you're like, oh, of course I know them. It's that same kind of thing.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. So, Wanderstop, it's set to release on the 11th of March, which is a few weeks away from when we're recording. And I read that development began about 7 years ago. Is that accurate?
Well, it really depends on what you consider development.
Mhm.
The very like start of this thing was really about 9 years ago, when I had a sort of a whole period of time after finishing Stanley Parable and Beginner's Guide, where I just wanted to go in a new direction and try something out. And I spent like months and months drawing for hours and hours every single day. And I was drawing all of these scenes of forests and cute buildings in the woods and shops,
Mm.
and I was just kind of had this like craving for sort of cozy. And this was pre Stardew. This was all kind of in the before cozy games was a genre type of thing. And
Mhm.
I was just like really fixated on this sort of aesthetic of what could be done in this, like, because I was just looking for a release from all of the kind of more dark and difficult stuff that I had been doing. And then it sort of snowballed, and it was like I began making a bunch of Twine prototypes, and then Annapurna came and got on board, and then we moved over to Unreal, and then shortly after kind of the getting into Unreal and properly like developing the game in 3D, which I was doing that in Austin at the time.
Mm.
And then that's when Karla, that's when we connected and sort of had a conversation about, hey, would this make sense for you to come on board? And God bless, because Karla did not. I mean, the game was not really clear at that time what we were making. And Karla said, yeah, sure, I'll help you figure out what the heck this game is that we're making.
The
Mm.
timing had worked out well for me just because I was I was leaving Fulbright at that time, and I was like,
Mhm.
what am I doing next? And Davey was like, why don't you do this nebulous project? And I was like, sounds great. Anyway.
Yeah, it was definitely part of the job description was like, help me figure this out.
Yeah.
What was it that appealed to you about that pitch, Karla, even in that rough, nebulous form?
Let's see. At that time, I remember being primarily, it was like vibes forward. It was very like,
Mm.
just the concept, and I was like, all right, that sounds like I've always my thing in games in general is always characters.
Mhm.
Like I am that's always the thing I care about the most, and I was just like, oh, a rotating cast of interesting characters, that sounds extremely up my alley. This is very
Mm.
cool. So that sounded really good to me. Obviously, like, it's also hard to say no to the overall vibes, like the whole, darkish green blue forest with like a single warm light, in the center coming from a cute little building. Like, come on. It's who
Yeah.
can say no to that?
Well, yes, exactly. That's a long time in development, and at the time of recording as well, the demo is out. We're part of Steam Next Fest. People are playing it. We're so close to release. How are you both feeling now that it's in people's hands, and also the full version is just weeks away?
I mean, it's weird. This has been, I mean, this project has been my life for, like the better part of a
Mm.
decade. And it's very weird. God, so many years of this project where I just couldn't understand how we would ever finish it.
Mm.
Like it just seemed, and in some ways we didn't, because the what the game was initially was quite different than what it is
Right.
now. And it really took reframing the whole like basic premise of what the experience was meant to be, in order to be able to finish it, let alone make it good. And so it's a very strange feeling now to be like, I've lived with this thing for such a big chunk of my life, and now I go and I see people experience it, and what they're getting is it's just like a weird byproduct. It's almost like sometimes it's hard for me to connect it to the years and years of development we did, because we went through so many different iterations and so many possibilities of what this thing could be. So it's like I'm seeing the Matrix. I'm seeing everything
Right.
Yeah.
simultaneously, and people are now just getting this one little version of it, and they seem to be loving it, and they seem to be having a great time with it. And so I'm very happy about that, but I'm also like weirdly disoriented by it.
Mm.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Like you're absolutely like the first thing when you make a game, the first thing that you think when you're watching someone else play it is like, wait, that used to be different. Was that better actually? Like, you know what? Also, like, oh God, I'm so glad that we put this version of this in because oh my God, it's so much better, or
Yeah,
whatever. And
yeah.
like,
And then the dreaded, oh my god, I could have rewritten that to be
yep,
Mm.
clear about this, and
yep.
all of that
Like, oh
all
no,
that
I
stuff
didn't get
too.
to that. Oh God.
Yeah,
Um,
like I wrote this thing for 7 years, and I'm like, oh god, I wish I had a little more time to,
there's a lot.
yeah.
There's a lot of text in that video game.
I know, I know, I
What
know.
was the final word count? Approximately?
113,000.
Oh
Jeez
my God.
Louise. Yeah,
100,
it's a big
yeah,
boy.
Wow.
110 something. I forget what.
Yeah, it's a big guy for sure.
Yeah. Well,
It's
you got
wild.
so on the video feed, I can see you got a Disco Elysium poster and behind you. I mean, they're pushing 1 million
Oh
words,
yeah.
I think. So like
Woo!
Yeah.
we could have had it worse, but it was a
Holy
lot. It was a
shit.
lot of writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, just doing anything for 7 years, the emotional connection you're going to make to that, right? But
Yeah. It's hard. Yeah, and it's hard. Like I can't separate the weight of that from the
mhm.
final product. But I'm
Right, of course.
trying to, because it would be healthy for me to take it at face value, the way the experience that people are having with it, right? Like
Mhm.
because a lot of the experiences that people are having are really positive. and so I know I'm like, okay, that's I want to luxuriate in that a little bit, and also I'm realizing, oh, I don't just get to let go of all of the weight and the heaviness of this game's development just immediately. And I think I mean, God, with my other games, I would say it with them it always took several years
That was what I was gonna say.
after
Right.
they came out. Like I remember after Stanley came out, I think it was like 2 years after the game came out, and I was I forget what I was doing. I was just looking up something about it and reading some things people said, and I was like, oh my God, you guys, I think people really like Stanley Parable. And I wanted to like go to my friends and be like, I made this game and people are really liking it. Oh my God, and of course, like everybody's like, what the fuck are you talking about, right?
Yeah.
But it's like there's something where it takes a couple years.
It has to settle. I feel like that's normal. Like
Mm,
because your context has to change from being in the middle of it
mm,
such that you can see nothing else to slowly you have to slowly climb out of that and be able to be like, oh, this thing that I've been in the middle of has been like, it's no longer like just kind of growing and mutating. Like it's no longer something I have to keep track of. It's a frozen finished thing.
mhm.
And people are experiencing like that, so you have to kind of like shift your perspective, like, because it's so easy after especially a lot of years like Davey's been on this project. It's so easy to just keep in that like, well, I'm still working on this, I have opinions on these things, I should fix that, I should like, what if we did this instead? And it's like, man, gotta gotta appreciate you've graduated, but it's gonna take a while.
Yeah. I'll hit you up in 3 years and ask how you think about the game.
There you
Yeah,
go.
yeah. But the good news
Perfect.
is that so far the responses have been largely quite positive,
Yay.
Mm.
and so yeah, so I'm looking forward to being able to appreciate them in 3 years.
I haven't been looking, frankly, because
Yeah.
I tend to not like, I don't want to hear from, like, it's done. Like
Yeah.
it's sort of it's akin to that David Lynch quote where he's like, the movie is the talking. It's just kind of like,
Mhm.
you go ahead, it's done. I don't want to hear about your experience.
I don't
Mhm.
know why. I usually feel that way, and for some reason on this one, I'm like wanting some amount of like
Interesting.
validation from randos, and I think it might just be that like the project got so heavy for me, and I
Mm.
felt so much fear
Right.
throughout, and so there's this. I'm getting just like a little bit of aloe salve on that wound of just getting like, oh, okay, some amount of recognition that yes, we may have
Right.
actually made this into a good thing.
Mm.
Um,
Well, importantly, like, this is, I mean, the beginner's guide was pretty, like, approachable, like,
yeah, but I really,
user friendliness wise, but
but
like,
but I went into that knowing that it was not for like quote unquote audiences, right?
exactly,
Like,
that's what I'm trying to say.
yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
yeah, I
I'm
was
Okay.
This one's a
very
lot
aware, and
more.
Stanley, I had no
Yeah.
expectations at all. So this one
Right.
is kind of the first one that I'm going into like, no, I actually am making this for an audience, and
Right.
so there is some extent to which seeing that there is an audience for it is like, oh, I am
Thank
actually
goodness.
getting
Yeah.
to fulfill some kind of desire or expectation that I had, I suppose.
Right, because that's part of the work as well. Like, you had to be like, how are we going to make this approachable? How are we going to, allow people to connect with this easily? Like, just, show up and make
Mm.
the barriers to entry low, kind of thing. Um, Whereas, yeah, that's definitely something it's good to see feedback on.
And
Yeah, I can imagine.
and this is like for better or for worse. Well, I don't know. I'll let you decide. But that's part of what the getting up in the morning, being like, I'm a piece of shit. Like that's part where that comes from. Is you're like, it's not about me. If I was making
Mm.
this game for me, you know what I mean? Then
Mhm.
it would be. Then I would be able to approach. I'm not saying it like that you magically become free when you stop making things for an audience, but when audience consideration is a tentpole value in your creative process, it means letting go of yourself in a particular way
Yeah.
that you can do that however you want, but for me it comes out as a very like self-deprecating, like I need to constantly be cutting myself down a little bit to keep from getting too attached to something I've made because it's not for me, right? It does not
Interesting.
matter what I feel about it in the moment. What matters is an audience getting it and connecting with it. And I
Yeah.
really, really entrenched in that headspace on a project.
Yeah. I remember seeing that sort of come over you over time. That's interesting because I'm really used to disappearing into the work. Like I'm like I
Yeah.
work on the work and I try to make the work better. And like it's not like I don't have my own preferences. Like I sure do, but like also if they don't serve the work, which is the purpose of doing this, all this labor, then what good is it, right? But that's just the way I operate. So like yeah, I remember seeing you sort of lean more into that stuff.
Yeah.
And I know that you do take people's feedback very seriously during dev. Like you're very willing to be like, oh, this didn't connect with you, I will find a way to make
Yeah.
this connect with you. So I know you already had that like ability, so I suspect you just kind of extended that, but it is sort of a different
Well,
viewpoint.
so before this project, the longest I'd ever worked on an individual SKU, let's say, was 2 years, right?
Okay.
Mhm.
And Wanderstop for me, just like primary development, was about 7 years, let alone some pre-production stuff.
Yeah.
And what I learned about myself is that it's interesting, Karla, hearing you say that it kind of like ramped up because I think I realize in hindsight that, at least for me, there's something about that like audience first mentality that has a snowballing effect, right?
Yeah.
And
Oh, interesting.
over the course of 2 years, it wasn't pronounced enough for me to recognize it.
Mm.
Like it never snowballed enough for me to lose track of myself and
Hmm.
my own preferences and interests. But on Wanderstop, I wouldn't say that I started it in a fundamentally different way than any of those previous ones, but I think somehow by virtue of the longer it went on, the more I felt like and again, this was a new experience for me, but it felt like I needed to justify the amount of time that we were spending on it. And so
Right.
somehow, like I needed audiences. This is like, again, I don't recommend this mindset, but it was like, oh, if I spent 2 years on Stanley Parable, then if I spent 7 years on Wanderstop, it has to be 3 times as, whatever.
Yeah.
Which is obviously like a total fallacy in thinking about stuff. But that was what I unconsciously was, something like that was happening. And so the audience, the focus on the audience in that sense began to snowball and pick up momentum. And the
Hmm.
longer that the thing went on, the bigger and bigger it got for me. And again, I have no problem with like going to the grindstone again and again and again and again and again until the audience is having the reaction that I want them to have. But what I didn't account for was the toll of the accumulated cost of doing that work over 7 years.
Yeah.
Right. And I made a mistake in estimating my capacity to maintain that consistently throughout that whole period of development.
Yeah.
It should be noted that when Davey talks about, uh, you know, going back and continuing to work to make things land well, often this is a pretty serious long process. Like Davey has rewritten like big chunks of the game in response to people's feedback that they don't understand something or they don't feel that something lands or anything like that many times. So like this should not be underestimated when it comes to the amount of work getting done. This isn't just like, oh, people won't stop nitpicking me, I'm so tired of rewriting, of changing a single word in a sentence. It is not that. It is much bigger than that.
No, I really am feeling the. It's interesting. I'm feeling the emotional toll that this has had on you, Davey, just from this conversation in a way that I really appreciate you saying it. But it's so reflected in the work, right? I mean, this is a game about burnout. It's about
Yeah.
perfectionism, and I think you did maybe it was one of the first reveals for it for a PC gamer thing. You said that you set out to make a game to heal you from your own burnout.
Yeah.
Yep.
And to hear this, to hear that, how much you've poured into it and how much the themes have been reflected in the creation of it is, I don't know, it sounds. How do you wrestle with that? How do you wrestle that you're making a game about
Poorly.
facing that? Right. Okay.
No, I mean, so there's really two things to it, and the first is that you have to have some amount of confidence that your personal story is actually interesting to other people, which
Mm-hmm.
I don't always believe that, and sometimes I need other people to like, there's parts of this game that are like, pages out of my diary, right? And
Mm,
and I think that it's easy to be like, why would someone else want to read a page out of my diary? You're so used to the voice in your head that you think that it's trite or banal, when in many cases it actually is like it creates a lot of space for people
mm-hmm.
to explore what they're going through and ways
Exactly.
that it connects or overlaps with them. But that is a process that's like a whole thing that you have to kind of get over. And I've in a lot of my work, I've found that whenever I can't figure out a way forward, I just go back to the diary, right? And
Mm,
I mean that metaphorically speaking, but
mm-hmm.
that's what whenever we had a lot of times on this project where we were like, well, God, what's the way forward? How do we? Something is missing. There's a chunk of something in this story, and a lot of how we would do it is, or one of the ways that we got through that was I would sit down and be like, okay, well, in my darkest, ugliest hour, here's how this occurs to me, and then we would more or less just like take that and build story, elements around it.
Mm,
And so in a way, so there's one way in which it's convenient, right?
yeah.
Because you have access to yourself constantly 24/7. So you're constantly giving yourself this stream of let's call it content, right? You are a 24/7 content machine. And so there's a way in which it's like, whoa, it's just right there, it's just, I'm just firing this stuff out, pumping it directly into the lake. Let's use it. But so that's, I would say the first part is that it's convenience and being comfortable with the idea that it actually is interesting to other people. But
Mm-hmm.
the vast majority of it is really hard work. You put that journal entry into the game, and then it feels a little too trite and a little too out of place and a little like the pacing isn't quite lining up, and you're like, God, what's going on? And it's rewriting the lines again and again and again and again and again until they flow together, and until there's a feeling of like ease of consuming and connecting, and nothing is stepping on one another's toes, because because you've put so many of these chunks of yourself in. And again, this is not about you. This is not about what I personally think about it. It's about, is the audience connecting with it? And you
Mm-hmm.
put chunks in that are you, and they're so meaningful to you, and then they just don't fit in with the rest of the chunks, And
Mm-hmm.
there's so many times when we cut a thing that I was like, I love this. This is so like interesting to me or meaningful, and it did not slot in to any of the other pieces, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's really weird to be like, oh, this is so raw, this is so vulnerable, but also highly manicured to
Yeah.
to
Of course.
be accessible by someone who isn't me,
Mm-hmm.
It's
um
kind of what writing is like. I mean, the thing is, okay, so the important stuff about this here is that all art is self-portraiture. That's true. Um, the other thing is that what I always want to do in these situations when it comes to making characters land is they need like some serious specificity.
Mm.
And if that, like, you can do interviews, you can read, blog posts, you can like get information from people and try to synthesize them. But ultimately, some conscious entity has to do that synthesis. And that means you're relating to that character inside of your own head. There is like, it's like, I can't help but relate this um to like acting, like playing a part, or like or playing a character like in a tabletop game or something, where it's like you have all these elements that are like, you have specifics about the character, but ultimately you have to filter them through yourself. Like, you have to play that character, and that means you have to find the connections with that character that, fit yourself. Like, you have to be like, what parts of these are true to me? Yeah.
It's like the Jurassic Park dino DNA thing, right? Where
Probably.
they're like, we have these missing pieces of the genome
Yeah.
that we filled it in with frogs.
Yeah, sort of.
Right? It's like, oh, anywhere that the genome in the character is missing, I'll put my own DNA in to fill that section of it.
Yeah. So like, I think that everybody does this to an extent. Like, everybody is going to be like, how do I think about this? And and it's good because we're all different. So it, that this is how like you build up a style, and how people can recognize your work. They can be like, yes, this author tends to go for these themes and tends to like think about these specific things. And that's, what leads to that. Like, you are, regardless of the characters that you're putting forth, like, you're in there. And so just fucking getting out in front of it and like just being like, I am gonna deliberately, try to make this vivid with my own experience and thoughts, is like, it's a very good tactic. It works. Yeah.
It feels like the two of you are very aligned in many, many ways, but also balance each other. It's very interesting how, on the one side, Davey, you're saying you're putting like journal entries in here, but then you're both interpreting it with each other and sanding edges off. And it feels like a very tricky thing to do. But as you say, been working together for a long time, and that's why you are a good collaborative partners.
Well, we probably, after Karla joined this project, there was a good 6 months that was just like,
I don't even know.
Basically no work getting done, right? Despite our best efforts. And it was funny because, like, by the time Karla joined the project, I had written a bunch of stuff that was like fine, right? There were some aspects of like, the core journey that Alta was going on that were similar to how they are now, but that vast majority of it was not there. And it was funny because when Karla joined, I remember we had these conversations where I would show you scripts, and, be like, here's these dialogues for these characters, that you make tea for and whatever. And you'd be like, yeah, that's cute. That's nice. I think it's nice. I think it's good. And then, yeah, it was something in the like 6 months to a year kind of phase of us like starting to work together and click. And I don't know, Karla, if it's that you got more comfortable criticizing my work, or if it's that you just understood better what we were doing, or what
it's the latter.
What I was capable of. But because it was funny, because there were things that by a year later that you maybe early on you said, oh yeah, that's cute, that's kind of nice, that it would be like, oh, that would never fly now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it was funny seeing that evolution, because it had nothing to do with it's not like we were fundamentally different people, a year later.
It's just sinking into it. Yeah.
Yeah. We had yet to find the specific overlap in our sensibilities that the more than some of its parts kind of thing.
Right. Partially that. And like it's funny because we, like, you heard before we were talking about the concept of like not self-insertion, but the concept of like autobiographical elements or whatever. We were talking about these completely differently. Like we come at these things from completely different
Yeah.
directions, which
Yeah.
is very funny. But like, yeah, when it comes to stuff like this, like we didn't like the game didn't, it had some vibes, it had some like themes. It didn't have a lot of I didn't feel like I understood like the structure, the tent poles, the like I didn't I the true meat of the game was not yet apparent to me at the beginning. And
Doesn't
so
compare to me either, for what it's worth.
yeah. So it took me a while to like dig in there and be like, okay, what's actually important about this? Like how can we focus this? Because it's easy to kind of do the thing that you usually do, but like part of what I did want to do is kind of pull away from just the like we're doing this for the jokes and there isn't a lot of stuff under it, but the jokes are there kind of vibe, which is very easy for anyone to kind of fall into because it's like a good kind of a distraction tactic. Like you're having fun the whole time, like nobody's gonna be like I hated all those jokes, like but you get to the end of it and you're kind of like, was that all just little jokes?
Yeah.
So like, it took me a while to figure out that was a potential direction. And you knew it's not like you didn't know about that.
Okay, so let me go on a slight micro tangent here to say that when I started this project, I honestly thought that I could write things that were purely interesting for me, the writer, to write, and that would make a good, interesting, fun product. And this is a mistake that a lot of artists make, where they're like, I had fun making this thing and therefore the audience will have fun experiencing it, which is true some of the time. I'm not saying it's never true, but but it puts you at such a disadvantage to actually seeing what is interesting about your work beyond just, oh, this is a laugh that I had to myself. Because it's the classic thing where you in the moment you're writing and you're like, oh, I'm such a genius. And then you step away from it for a week and you come back and look at it, you're like, what the fuck was I thinking? Like, this is terrible. And, but because you had fun in the moment, it floods you get all this sort of serotonin in your brain and you stop thinking critically about it. And I genuinely believed that if I, because again, like my previous stuff was very, a lot very dark and cerebral kinds of stuff. And I was like, this time I'm just going to have fun. And a big part of what Karla, kind of eventually, as we started to really like, get in sync with one another was be like, buddy, you can't have fun on this and get the kind of product that you want this to be.
Interesting. Okay.
And I don't. You said it in your own way, in your own
like
kind
God,
of
I hope I
time.
didn't say that.
No, I know, but it was definitely. But that was a huge part of the influence that you had on me. Not, and I should say this: not just that you can make a better product, but that you can actually literally enjoy the process in a different kind of way. Right? Sitting and just writing jokes is fun in a certain way, but the pride and the satisfaction of knowing that you sat down with it again and again and again to dig up a truth kind of hidden deep within the story that you didn't initially see, and that you massaged and nourished it until that truth sort of found its way to the surface, is a whole other kind of satisfaction that is very delayed gratification, but it is extremely gratifying. And that was something that I honestly don't think I really ever treated my writing in that way until we started working together, and you, Karla, really pushed me to see it that way.
I'm really interested after this conversation we've had about the character of Boro, who is just the warm heart of this game. He's so comforting, he's so kind to Alter. I'd love to know where Boro came from and maybe whose voice is coming through Boro. out of the two of you more?
Boro was one of those ones that, like, he was basically fully formed when I showed up. I was like, of
Yeah.
course, it's Boro. Like, we got it.
Boro was free on this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He came free with your humanity. It was
So-
like, yeah.
So okay, so this is funny. So the other day I was actually doing an interview with someone else at a press outlet who I got to talk to her back in December because we did a little press junket for the Game Awards, and so I got to show her the first, little chunk of the game, and so the other day when I spoke to her, she said, "You said a thing at the Game Awards," which I did not remember saying this. Which is hilarious because it's definitely true, and I definitely said it, but I didn't. It was so spontaneous and in the moment that I didn't even remember it, which was that after all of the really dark, and I'm not saying that the characters from Stanley Parable Beginner's Guide are insincere, but they're all deceitful in some way.
They're very meta. Yeah.
Yeah, like they're all there's
Yeah.
meant to be a distance between you and every
Right.
character, and so
Yeah.
there was a kind of warmth that I think I have in me. I think that I have a lot of, Boro is a part of me, like, for sure. Alta is very much a part of me, but like Boro is, that guy is in me too. And what I said was that after so many years of writing very kind of dark and demanding content, that Boro was always there waiting for his turn. And the minute that I opened a window for him, he just tumbled out fully formed. And it almost is in that way where like it's like the first album thing, where your first album is like a collection of everything that you've thought about your entire life up till then. Well, Boro was kind of like that, but even though I have already been doing this for a while, he was there for a long time waiting to come out, but it was never his turn. And it was always I think he was always building momentum in a way and wanting a reason, but I never had the right circumstance or the right motivation or whatever. And it's almost as soon as I got into that early phase of, doing those, getting inspired by the aesthetics of sort of warm and cozy types of vibes, the minute that because I did a twine prototype that was where you walk through the woods and then come to a tea shop, and then, and there's a guy there selling you stuff. And so I did like a simple mock-up version of it. And I mean, there was that character is exactly the same in the version as
he's always been the same
as the current one. And so I it's hard to really say, except that I think in a way he was the product of a life spent pursuing very cerebral and heady kinds of artistic endeavors that, I feel that guy, and I feel that he's been there, and I feel he wants to nurture me, and he wants me to be, and then it's really nice. It's really nice when you can say to yourself, like, yeah, that thing is present in me enough that when it was his turn, he was so fully formed, and you're like, okay, I feel like that reflects nicely on, like, that's a good feeling for me to have,
Yeah.
Here's what's very funny about you saying that Boro has always been a part of you, because Boro was, very sweet, warm character who cares about people. He's also like communicates kind of weird, little hard to understand, a little inscrutable, a little opaque. How might this overlay with your own feelings about taking care of yourself?
Yeah,
that is very interesting.
So for here, all right. So no, we can get into the meat of it, right?
You don't. Though I wasn't like, you need to do a dissertation on this. I just thought it was funny.
No, I know. But we can treat this like, I enjoy taking this stuff at face value. When you have a character that is kind of vague or ethereal, you get to let whatever your audience fill in all the details,
Mhm.
right? And definitely in my own work, that's been something that I've done. With characters in my previous games, they've all been kind of like half characters that the player is filling in the remaining portion of them.
Oh, for sure.
Karla, you've obviously, spent a lot of time in your career building really fully three-dimensional fleshed out characters, but Wanderstop was kind of the first time doing that for me,
Mm.
right? Like taking characters and being like, this is a real person that really
Yeah.
exists, and they're gonna have all of the full, you're gonna see them in the full bigger picture of who they are, right? And
Mm.
all the ways that all the tiny mundane ways that they show up in the world, right? And so there's a lot of pros and cons to that. The pros are when you finish that character, you get the feeling of like, oh, this is a real person that almost, it's like they exist in your life, right? It's like they're sitting over your shoulder watching you play. The cons are it's really, really, really hard to develop that person, right?
Yep.
Just like every human being in the world, anybody that you like, that you meet, and you're like, oh my God, you're so wonderful. If you spend enough time with that person, you'll see all the tiny mundane things about them that maybe kind of bug you, or maybe they don't like this thing that you really like, and vice versa. And so but that's people, right? That's how people are. And Boro in my head was just a vibe, right? And then we made a game where he has to talk to you more or less nonstop for like 15 hours, right? And so that guy that was just a good feeling, warm, fuzzy kind of vibe had to not only talk to you for 15 hours, but also contextualize the emotional journey that Alta is going through, and literally tutorialize a significant amount of the game's systems and mechanics. And this is really, really hard for a lot of reasons. We had a lot of difficulty figuring out how much should Boro explain to the player what is going on in the story world. And
Yeah.
more often than not, we had to scale back on the amount that he says and explains.
Mhm.
But if you've played the game, he still explains a tremendous amount and says a tremendous amount. But it was this like constant going back and forth. And I think I was always pushing for him to explain more, and Karla would push back and be like, no, he doesn't need to explain so much. But it was this just perpetual, we talked a lot about like the kind of guru trope,
Yeah.
the Mr. Miyagi kind of trope of like, how much do you want the mentor guru character to actually come out and like berate the protagonist and be like, you just need to learn to chill out or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's so many examples of guide characters like that are just fucking insufferable, because they're so like smarmy and self-satisfied about how much they know and how much you don't know. And so we it was like, I remember specifically throughout a lot of the back half of the game, I initially wrote Boro as like trying to coach Alta through a lot of specific things that she was going through. And we actually had people on the team play it and be like, Boro lost me completely as a character when he started
Interesting.
explaining those things.
The minute he gets into like real, like actionable specifics, like he falls apart. Like you can't do that. He is a guy who he is about the vibes, and he can give you suggestions. He cannot be like, in through your nose, out through your mouth, count, like he can't be doing that. It is too
Tried.
like it's not him. Yeah, he is, and this is sort of why he is, but it's also like informed why he doesn't act differently. Is just he is a guy who does not understand things in the same way that we do. And there's actually a whole he has details about his character that are never put forth that sort of explain some of this stuff, as so that we could think about, because like often in games, like you have to be really clear on what a character is, even if a lot of that information is never actually given to the player, because you need to be able to always come from the same spot about them. You know what I mean? You need to keep them consistent. You need to have their shit nailed down. And so, yeah, he has has reasons for behaving this way, but like, but honestly, I think a lot of it is just that's how he is. And he was so like, when we tried to be like, you need to do more work, you need to really, be helping for real, actually, in a way that a person today, like a therapist, would help. We were like, no, that's not him at all. And it was actually very funny how strong people's reactions against that
Yeah.
were, because they also
Yeah.
got him immediately, and that was wrong, because Boro is a guy you get immediately. It's great.
Yeah.
And it's funny what Karla said about, because that was something we really honed in on, is Boro doesn't know, right?
Yeah.
It's not that he knows.
Yeah.
It's not that he knows the answers and he's refusing to tell them to you, because that was the frustrating thing that we.
Yes.
That was
Mm.
that was the kind of thing that we.
That was Arden's thing. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And it was Arden was consulted with us on the narrative, and we talked about that a lot, about how when the guru feels like they're holding out on you, then
Right.
like you're on a different wavelength. But Boro has to be on your wavelength the whole time. He
Right.
supports you and he's there for you, but he has the amount of information that you have about what's going on, right?
Yeah.
And so but it's also very freeing at that point to be like, oh, okay, great, I don't have to write him as though he, well, we didn't there was like because if Boro knows more than you do, then we have to walk this really fine tightrope of exactly how much he explains of his knowledge, exactly what he knows, and exactly how much he explains.
Right.
And so it was more, it was a lot more freeing to be like, oh, we just treat him like he's basically on the same wavelength as the player,
Right. He's just here. He's in this clearing, vibing. Stuff happens, stuff doesn't happen. People show up, they have problems. Well, if I can help, that's great. If not, well, they got to do it themselves. And it's like, that's it. Like, you can't, because as Davey says, like, the feeling of like, oh, you just don't think I'm ready yet for your mentorship is just like, fuck you, man. Like, I'm not, that's not gonna work.
Oh,
Like, it's not
I hate it
not a way
so
to.
much.
It's so bad.
Yeah.
Oh, it's the most infuriating thing in the story.
Yeah.
That is fascinating. If you knew that Boro was aware of the situation, it would totally have changed how comfortable I think I would have felt in the game.
Yeah.
I mean, even then, I still see people who are like, is Boro like, has he trapped you here in purgatory or something? Which I think it's just like really hard to get away from that. But I think that people only say that at the start of the game. Like by the time they get through the game, they're like, okay, no, he's on
like, there's no room for this.
He's on my side. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It's funny because here's the other good thing about him is that he models the chillness and like going with the flowness that Alta can never get anywhere near. So like he's also just a really good kind of, I don't know, conceptual backwards mirror for her, like, foil. And that's really cool, is like, because every time he shows up, you're like, you are fine. You're not endlessly striving and bumping your head against a wall, till it bleeds. Like, what, poor Alta, like, she's constantly having to confront this, but he's so disarming that even she can't be mad at it most of the time. But like, he's a very clear, like he's a different way to deal with this from Alta, and that is up front. Yeah.
He's a great character. I warm to him immediately.
He's great.
And I'd love to know, if you have the ability to gather data on this once the game's out, I'd just love to know how many people make cups of tea for him when they're brewing them for other people. Because we had a very strict regiment where if we're making any cups of tea, we gave one to Boro, and we had a mug that we specifically just give to Boro as well.
Oh, good.
Like,
that's delightful.
So I'd love to know if people have a similar relationship with him.
That's delightful. I love that.
What's funny is, in our playtest experience, very few people make tea for Boro, and
what?
That's ridiculous.
It was like pretty surprising, and actually to the point where I would like, I added several like conversations for him that were like, hey, if you feel like making me a cup of tea, I'll always take one. But it just, I don't know. And at the end of the day, I was fine with that, because it's the kind of thing where when you do make tea for Boro, and we we worked really hard on all of those conversations that he has with you. And I wanted all of them to like reveal a little something about him and in his world and how he sees things and whatever. And so, of course, it was very, important to do that. But as with much of this game, the if it works because there's the option for the player to ignore it entirely.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
And
you gotta trust the player. You gotta.
yeah. And so it had to be something that like the thing in the play tests that I would, make sure to ask people is like, were you aware that existed? And as long as they at some point were like, oh yes, I was aware of that, then it's fine, because like, because people are, because basically you create this space and you put all of this stuff in it, and then you kind of trust people to navigate it in the way that is consistent with the experience that they're having. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I have, like, as a writer, I have to be okay with writing, thousands of words of dialogue that the player can, just totally gloss over. And then, but then they stumble onto that one conversation or that one line that hits them really hard. But then the problem is you have to consistently get all of the words to a high enough standard that whichever line they stumble onto, that you're like, yes, that's line is, I think, gonna hit you and like have a good, you're gonna have a good response to it.
Totally.
Tremendous amount of work.
Yeah. Like I've had like people I worked with at various points, every once in a while you get somebody going like, well, people don't read anymore, so we should probably just restate everything at all times and really like, overwrite so that we can be sure that people aren't missing anything. And I'm always just like, man, if you're writing for those people who literally are not engaging with, such a large part of your game, I just find that fundamentally like misguided. Like you can't, like, you want to make it easy for people to get the information, but the idea of like stepping over into their realm and being like, no, we got more, please, more. Here's more things. Do you get it yet? Do you care yet? Is like, man, is just anathema to me. And that is like, the audience has got to find the thing.
Yeah, man. Karla, there's even some things in the game where some lines and conversations where as it got down to the wire of deciding what was going to go in and what wasn't, there's a couple where I was like, Karla, I'm just going to restate a theme here for the second or third time. I'm sorry. I just feel there's a handful where you were like, all right, fine. If it's important to you, which I don't know if it was actually meaningful or not, but
I don't know either.
I think it's just like you get toward the end of a giant thing and you get a little antsy and you're like, oh, I'm just, but you pushed back on so many of them and cut out so much of it that it would have been, if I had truly been left to my own devices, it would have been way more ham-fisted than it is.
I super have to believe that like the player they can understand this stuff. They're smart. Like that doesn't mean that you should just be kind of like, I gave you a couple clues, deal with it. Obviously, but you gotta kind of let people in. But like, I definitely believe in people's capability to decode, big themes and moments and motivations. And like, I don't know, for me it's kind of like, why is anybody making anything if you can't trust the player to figure some of it out? Like there's so much value in allowing the player to be more of a participant in putting together pieces and figure things out a little bit. Like I often talk about this, but there's a known phenomenon called the IKEA effect that we put to great use in Gone Home, which is specifically that a thing that is built or made or, understood by someone with their own hands and brain, like they participated in the creation of a thing, they now value that much more than an equivalent other thing that they didn't participate in. So if you can manage to draw people in and be like, I am gonna invest in this. It's
Yeah.
fucking great. And they generally like feel much more connected to it because of that. But you know, if you assume they're never going to do any of the thought work themselves, then you kind of preclude that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm very glad that the two of you that you and your partner did go
Yeah.
out of your way to see those dialogues with Boro. That is very it is very
Yeah.
gratifying when
You
someone
put in the
does
work. Yeah.
do that and someone does go. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
Not to enthuse too much, but I think what was really important and special for me in sharing it with my partner is what I told you, I think it was before we started recording, is she normally doesn't like games that leave it to you to find things yourself. She likes things to be very guided. Those are the kind of games that she
Mm.
enjoys. So what was really great about playing this game with her is that she was discovering things and finding things out for maybe like the first time in a game like this.
Wow.
And I think the game actively being like, do it because it doesn't matter. You know, do this because there's no goal. You're just doing this for the joy of doing it. Seeing her react to that felt very, 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 I don't know, special, I guess is maybe the word I'd use. It was lovely to see her delight in, you know, giving a cup of tea to a pluffin and seeing the effect of that, right? Like that was just
Wow.
really great.
Yeah,
But
that's great. That's
That's
wonderful.
really interesting. So it sounds like she felt like the pressure of doing everything right was maybe lessened, or
100%. Yeah.
okay.
Absolutely. This is someone who, when she plays like Persona 5, she played it last year, she had like 2 spreadsheets of information to
Yeah.
make sure she do
I know the
everything
type.
spot
Yeah.
on. Yeah.
You know, I've had this conversation with people who are not like not like I hate to use the word gamers, but you know, like
No.
people who are not like, you know, familiar with playing games where
Yeah.
I've heard people say like, I don't like that you keep failing, right? Like, you play a
Yeah.
game and you
Mm-hmm.
keep failing, and then the you know, the fundamental disconnect that is obvious to us but is not obvious to other people is like, yeah, that's the point.
Yeah.
The
Uh-huh.
whole point
Yeah.
of the
Mm-hmm.
video game is that it's safe to fail because literally nothing can hurt you, right?
Yeah.
But then of course, you know, communicating that is we've been indoctrinated into this our whole lives, you know, as
Yeah.
children. Our sponge brains absorbed that at a very early age, that it was okay to fail, you know. Yeah.
Right. In context, like it still doesn't fucking feel good, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Like
No.
that's the thing.
But you're not, you know that you are not in danger, right?
Right. The
You know,
game
Mm-hmm.
isn't gonna
like,
hurt you. Yeah.
yeah, you know
Mm-hmm.
it can't hurt you, and you know that in the worst case scenario, you'll just be like, "Oh, I just don't like this," and you'll put it down and you won't pick it up anymore, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
no actual. I mean, some people get very obsessive about it,
They
obviously,
do.
but there
Mm-hmm.
is freedom there, you know. And actually, on
Right.
Wanderstop, I think we worked really hard at trying to communicate that. I mean, honestly, one big way in which this really showed up for us was the intro, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
a big part of why I think I mean, the intro was a whole giant mess of a conversation in development trying to figure this thing out, because there was a lot of trepidation about, can we start our cozy game with like a 4-minute long, completely non-interactive cutscene? And
Right.
what I think felt at the time, and what I feel like I feel sort of vindicated about it now, is that to me, a part of the value of it is in letting the player know immediately, right off the bat, that what you're here for is to see someone go through something difficult, is to watch a
Mm-hmm.
character go through something difficult. And I think that what I've seen in people is that helps alleviate the feeling of obligation to the systems of the game, because
Yeah.
they've been given a grounding rod outside of that they can always turn back to that, right? They can
Mm-hmm.
always say, if anything in the game ever starts to feel like it's frustrating or overwhelming, they can always go back to like, right, but that's why I'm here.
Yeah.
You know, I've been
Mm-hmm.
given like a context that
Mm-hmm.
you know, that wraps itself around all of these systems and tells me that it's okay to fail, because failure is literally what the game is about. And so I feel very I'm very glad that we ended up putting the amount of time and effort into the intro that we did, because I do think that it's the right way to, if we had just started people in the cozy game aspect of it and then revealed the story as we went along, I think we would have had a much harder time giving people the right context for those mechanics and systems.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The emotional context would have been extremely different. Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
Yeah, and then I really do think it kind of infuses the rest of the experience of the systems, knowing always that is why you're doing all of these systems, why you're participating with all of this stuff in the world, is because you're literally only here because of the emotional context, so I think that, and I'm very glad to hear you say that, to hear you William, hear you say that in the first place, just because it was so much of what we were hoping again for years and years, like, oh, I hope people feel about this.
Like it's a potentially, like, I some of our hopes were that this kind of game where you're like, oh, right, the stakes for just kind of doing shit around the clearing, the stakes are low. It's okay. You can't, like, no one's even gonna come up to you and be like, no, that was wrong.
Which is funny, because ostensibly that's what the cozy game genre is about, but we've completely gotten away from that,
It's super true.
We've gone, like, and I'm gonna be a boomer about this, but back in my day, we had an Animal Crossing where nothing happened.
Hell yeah. We had an Animal
Crossing where you couldn't do shit. You walked around and talked to every character to find out if they had an errand for you to run, and if they didn't, well, guess what, buddy? You're done. Just meander around for a while then.
Go find some fucking fossils, asshole.
Whatever, right? And
absolutely.
now you have the Animal Crossing that has the, like, 10 million tasks that are, like, explicitly spelled out for you.
It's such a thing.
Which I get. This is just
this is what happens.
Really? Yeah,
like, look at the Case of the Golden Idol, like the first Case of the Golden Idol, and then the new version where they're like, okay, actually, you don't have to move your mouse over the whole map in order to find interactable areas. We'll just call them out. And I'm like, you know what? I understand why you did this. I'm also a little mad.
Yeah.
Like it.
I get that.
There's but yeah, totally. It's like,
funny because there are people who see who these games that are meant to just be like, it's so cute, it's so cozy, do it at your own pace, do whatever. But then it's the classic thing where when you're given infinite, when you're given no limitations and no boundaries, it's more torture than to have like a nicely inscribed sort of space for you to exist in.
Right. It's like, it's intrinsic, extrinsic motivation. It's like very, core to us. Like the whole thing where it's like, if you have 1 million tasks in Animal Crossing, the minute you run out of those tasks, you're like, well, I'm done. Like you have not learned anything about making your own amusement, or like, getting invested in something on your own. You only do the tasks. And that is like, extrinsic motivation, where you get rewarded. Like, it's not just fun to do the thing, you get a reward when you do the thing. It literally diminishes your likelihood to keep doing that thing, unless the reward is present. Like, it is very straightforward. Like, you don't find the fun inherent in things if you're strongly extrinsically rewarded. Like, you just never have that chance. And so like what Davey's saying, like, Davey plays, fucking whatever Dark Souls shit all the time, and loves this, and loves to throw himself at games that kind of hate him a little bit, which isn't me, but like I absolutely, like, I have to mentally often go into the space of just being like, yo, it's just a game, just play it. Like, it's okay if you fuck up, it's a game. Like, I do have to remind myself of that occasionally. And so like, it's cool to potentially give an opportunity to people to have that kind of realization in a game like this, because maybe then they can move along to other games and be like, oh, right, like maybe, the game will be a little mad, but also whatever, it's a game. Like that feels like kind of a gift to me to people who haven't like really developed that skill. It's a skill. Like learning from failure is actually a skill, like in real life and also in video games.
And it makes me like weirdly mad that this is like a unique thing for a game to do. You know what I mean? I mean, and it's fine. It's like it's not actually. It's one of these things that's so dumb and small to be upset over. But we had this conversation so many times in development about intrinsic and extrinsic, motivation for doing stuff, and I just kind of feel like, oh man, the fact that like we actually did that this feels different, is almost like I'm almost like slightly resentful about it, but not really. I mean, it's, whatever.
Yeah, but I think it's an interesting conversation to have because, even Stardew does have fail states, right? You can collapse and pass out, which when you think about it is like,
I had to, and I love games like this, but I had to, even with Stardew and lots of other similar games, I have to really work to turn off my, failure aversion brain.
Oh,
yeah.
You
have to remind yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm aware I've kept you talking for ages. Thank you. I could keep it going, but I'll draw a line in because I know, Karla, you need to leave. I just want to say that I love the game. I think it's a really special thing, and it did a lot for me personally. I when I left games media like 2 years ago, I was so burned out, and seeing myself reflected in this was fantastic. So can't wait for more people to play it. Before we leave, what we like to do at the end of these interviews is ask our guests if they have any current hyperfixations, anything that you're currently like really obsessed with, whether it's, it can be anything. It can be a book, it can be a piece of furniture, a sauce, anything. So, do you have any hyperfixations that you would like to share?
That's a good one. I've been listening to someone read Moby Dick on they made a podcast, like technically it's whatever, it's a podcast on my podcast app, but it's literally just someone reading through Moby Dick. Like I imagine I could have gotten a normal audiobook, but it's just somebody doing their best. Weirdly enjoyable.
It's
What's
just
it's
called?
Really let's see. It's there's like there's a group or something that they read Loyal Books, LOYAL books.com. They do public domain reads of things. So they have a bunch of like Jeeves and Wooster books and like whatever all, which is just like a delight, a good time.
That's great. That's a great hyperfixation.
I like, it's great. Like Moby Dick is actually, I've read it a number of times because I'm a weird dork, but it's like I almost feel like there's a certain type of dork that will reread a long book periodically, and you just have to pick which one it is. You have to be like, is it Dune, is it Infinite Jest, is it whatever, right? But I am that type. But like it's one of those books that people treat it like it's like dense and boring, but it absolutely isn't. Like he manages to Melville manages to like it goes along. Like there's some bits where you're like, okay, that's a lot of different kind of whales, thank you very much. But like he mostly moves it along and keeps and I think he primarily does it via the like emotional content of of how the narrative character is relaying this stuff. Like he always kind of personifies things that he's talking about. It's very cool, and he manages to make it more personal than abstract, which is like, for me, it's the only way to do things. So it connects well with me. That was just the first thing I thought of. I don't know, you got something, Davey?
Well, it's what's tough for me is that like, historically my hyperfixation has been work, and which is really a thing that I'm working on changing that, because I don't that's not really how I want to be going forward. But I mean, like literally now I'm in the middle of, like taking a break because now that the game is done, I'm like, okay, I'm trying to learn how to like not do anything.
This doesn't sound familiar at all, Davey. I don't know.
I know. Well, this is why I say I feel like it's so trite, is because that's like, oh wow, what a deep and obscure connection to the work you've made. It's like, no, it's like it feels very simple, but I am actually trying to like find things that I can, enjoy and appreciate more outside of work.
Oh, just to put in real quick, it's not trite, it is the truth. There's a difference between these things. Anyway, go ahead.
It's a really good way of putting it.
Yes, it is. Yeah. I feel like the truth all the time then.
Yep.
I was gonna say, this is like, I wish I had a non-video game thing because I feel like that would be more cultured of me. But there is a hyperfixation that I've had for years that I like literally can't get out of my head, and I don't know why. But it's I really really like parrying systems in games. I'm like really obsessed with parrying, and I have a thing. I have a sort of whole obsession where around the way that the type of enemy attack patterns that FromSoft popularized, where the whole point is to like dodge roll, or in the case of like Sekiro, parry. And so all of the information is communicated in the animation of the attack, because you're watching for this moment when the attack is going to land. And so but basically what they do is they make the animations look really weird and staggered and unnatural, so that it's hard to read when the attack is going to land. And so I honestly have this weird fixation on like, I play every game I can that has some form of this kind of like attack pattern that you're meant to read, and I have them like cataloged in my head by best to worst, because I think that a game that is like confident enough in itself to like communicate to you when the attack is going to land, and doesn't require it doesn't fall back on like really obscure and obtuse animation timings to be challenging, is I think that's the cheap way out, is to make animations that deceive you. And I really like games that are actually confident enough in their animations and attack patterns to like communicate to you when the attack is going to land, and trust that it will actually still be challenging regardless, if they develop those attacks in ways that are interesting and varied and fluid and dynamic, and have a sense of like realism to them in a way.
Yeah.
So anyway, I like extensively catalog games that do have these different types of attacks and whatever.
You've got to tell us what's top of that list.
Oh, well, it's Sekiro. I mean, Sekiro is
Right,
like and even then, I'm not saying Sekiro is perfect. Like, Sekiro does a lot of this weird stuff, but there will just be like bosses in that game that are like, that trust that they're like, they do not feel like insane mega beasts that can only attack with, they're just humans. They're like humans that are real people, but so much work has gone into making a single human being look and feel so fluid in how they attack, that you even just like parrying a single sword attack has personality in that game. And so, but then, I do actually think that I have a lot of issues with Sekiro, and then sometimes there will be like, a boss in another game, like in an Elden Ring, or even, like Lies of P had some pretty good ones that I thought were pretty decent, where it's like, oh, you have the ability to do that, but you only put it on this one enemy, and then the rest,
interesting,
like, we have to make them all weird and obscure and whatever. Yeah. And then you have things like Nine Souls, which really leaned into this, but Nine Souls is hand drawn. And so the problem is that they have to rely on time between frames of the animation. And then it's really problematic because then they're forcing you to just learn timings, right? The more fluid the animation is, the easier it is to communicate. And that was why I wanted to like Nine Souls so much more, but because of the art style is very beautiful, but because the art style took so much work, it meant that they're like less capable of putting in the fluidity, that appreciate.
The whole like responsive / information rich, like to looks cool animation slider is always such a thing.
It's and you know, it has thematic overlaps with writing where it's the same thing,
Yeah.
where you're like, can you trust the player with something mundane and simple and true and trust that they will actually get it, versus do you need to do a bunch of flourishes and a bunch of, oh, look how fancy my work is, in order to think that they're having a good time, when actually they would have a great time if you trusted them with something simple and straightforward that presents itself clearly. So anyway, I don't know. I guess that has some sort of overlap, but I'd really just like parrying well communicated attacks.
I love that.
I was just reading about somebody in the tabletop game world who was making a tabletop game. I don't know whether it's done yet. I've been trying to find them. I cannot remember who they are, but they were making a game that is entirely about parrying, like even in the conceptual space. like you're going, yeah, and it sounded really charming. I wish I could find it. I guess if I locate it, I will send you a link, Liam. But
yeah, I'll pop it in the show notes. No, that's totally fine. And those are two great hyperfixations. I've never read Moby Dick. I should really do that at some point.
There's a lot of things out there.
I mean, there's also that too, right? Like, yeah. But speaking of, like, I cannot get into Souls games. I just don't have the muscle memory for them.
Yeah,
I forced a friend to just like play Bloodborne with me last year, and I just watched Bloodborne, and I was like, great, because he's very much like you, Davey. He has waxed lyrical about the Lies of P attack animations and that sort of like staggered trying to trick you. It's fascinating. I just can't do like the first boss of any of them, unfortunately. But
I'm with you. I'm bad at it.
But I genuinely do think that I'm like, even though I like these games, I feel very critical of them because how they frame these kinds of bosses as just being a muscle memory thing, and they kind of like train you in that. And I wish that the actual visual communication of the attack was more generous and more accessible. And I genuinely don't think they would be less challenging. I don't think the difficulty is the problem. I think it's that people feel like the game is trying to trick them, and they feel bad because they're constantly falling for the game's tricks. And I don't think that's but everybody on the face of the earth took that lesson away from Dark Souls, right? They're like, the challenge comes from tricking people. And I genuinely don't think that's the case.
No.
But yeah.
Yeah. I totally agree. And not to get too lost in the weeds about this, but that's like, I finished it like challenging games like Metroid Dread. I found very difficult, but the way that it communicated progress through that and how to defeat things, I thought was really intuitive and accessible.
It's on your side. The game is on your side.
Yes.
Yeah. And then again, it's great. And I love that people are into this with Dark Souls stuff, but I dislike that the lesson everybody learned is the game has to feel like it hates you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, thank you to both of you so much for jumping on. I really, really do appreciate it, and for taking the time and just to have this discussion. It's been fantastic. So good luck with the rest of development and with release. And yeah, thanks again.
Thank you. Yeah, this is fun. I had a good time.
It was a delight.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Indieventure is a video games podcast created, produced, hosted, and edited by Rachel Watts, Rebecca Jones, and me, Liam Richardson. For more information, including a list of every game we mentioned in this episode, make sure to check out our website, indieventurepodcast.co.uk. You can get in touch by sending your questions, comments, and feedback to contact@indieventurepodcast.co.uk. You can support the show by rating us 5 stars and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast provider of choice. Some of the games we talk about on the show may have been provided to us for free for review consideration. Our intro music and stings were composed for us by Ollie Newbury. Check the episode description to hear more of his excellent tunes. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks for another episode of Indieventure. Bye for now.